Hi, everyone. So it's been a while since I've done an astrology of Kink, and I'd really like to get that started again. That series started again. And so I had a few charts that I thought would be interesting to talk about and look at within this particular phenomenon. And if anybody is watching and wants me to use their chart to analyze their kink, please feel free to contact me at garthastro.com, and I will be happy to do so. So today I am looking at a phenomenon. It's a relatively new phenomenon. I'm sure nothing is new under the sun, right? They say. So I'm sure stuff like this was happening before, but it's become kind of a known phenomenon, or it's become kind of a cultural, something that's kind of popped up, bubbled up from the recesses of the culture. And it's called, or I call it, the Sissy phenomenon. And so I thought we would talk a little bit about what Sissy is, if for those who don't know, and then we would also look at some charts of Sissies and see if we can kind of get an idea of that. So back in the 70s, there was a woman by the name of Nancy Friday. She was a psychologist slash sexologist, and she wrote two very important books about female sexuality, My Secret Garden, and I forget the name of the second one. I wish I could remember. Never mind. But she wrote also a book on male sexuality called Men in Love. And that was the first time that I ever saw the official definition of the word transvestite. Now, transvestite is a word that we don't use any longer, thankfully. And tranny, transvestite, that kind of thing. Now we use the term transgender, but specifically to talk about gender orientation. But as per Nancy Friday and the psychological community in the 70s, a transvestite was somebody who derived sexual pleasure from cross-dressing. So you had cross-dressers, you had drag queens, who were generally gay men who, for entertainment purposes, might dress up. You've always had transgender people, and mind you, transgender people have always kind of crossed over into the drag queen community, right? So you've always had what we call the real girls in the drag queen community, and many of whom lived as girls or lived within their kind of quasi non-binary or in their female persona for the most part. But then you had just regular old gay men who were notorious drag queens, right? So you had kind of this clowning aspect of cross-dressing, which goes way, way back. As a matter of fact, the very first person to ever sing W.C. Handy's St. Louis Blues in public in 1912 was a female impersonator. And so think about Flip Wilson and Geraldine, think about Jamie Foxx and Wanda. It's always been used, it's always been used for comic effect, right? And so that's really where this drag queenage, we're not talking about being a drag queen today, right? We're talking about Sissy. You had the transvestite for whom dressing up or cross-dressing created sexual arousal. But this is something different. The Sissy is something a little bit different. So from what I understand, it started as a femdom phenomenon. So you would have dominatrixes who would have male clients, and as punishment or as a form of domination over them, they would feminize them. And then they would take it to the next step, is that they would not only feminize them, but then they would turn them into cocksluts. And so there's a whole, I don't want to call it like a cottage industry of female dominatrixes who are doing hypno videos to turn men into sissies. There's this whole genre of sexual hypno that I had no idea about, until a few years ago, and started showing interest in the sissy phenomenon itself. And also there's stuff for turning straight men gay. There's hypno for turning straight men gay. There's all kinds of fascinating things. Hypno for making you masturbate for 24 hours, whatever. But a lot of the hypno that you originally saw, as far as Sissy was concerned, was a very beautiful female dominatrix who would be basically coercing or pushing the person into, like I said, becoming a serving cock. And there tends to be a racialized aspect to it as well. So it's not always just cock, but black cock, but it's certainly alpha. So there's this aspect of the sissy as sub, as a kink sub, as sissy as beta sub, and so beta that they turn towards they are turned towards the feminization and then towards expressing themselves sexually in that role. And so I think that's what's really a little bit different about sissy, and what's kind of new about it is that it's really not about, it's not drag, and not all sissies are transgender, right? There are transgender sissies. There are people who identify as trans who are sissy. There are people who do not identify as trans who are sissy. There are people who didn't identify as trans, got into sissy, and then started to identify as trans, right? So there's this huge kind of interesting phenomenon that's got a very strong sexual undercurrent to it, but it's traversing both the areas of identity, gender identity, and sexual identity, which is what I find so fascinating about it. So, you're probably saying, so why the hell are you a sissy, Angela? I'm like, well, in a way I kind of am, but I'm not so much with the feminization part. But I became interested in this because I was sick of gay culture and gay men, and was interested in something else, and started realizing that quite a few people who considered themselves sissy actually considered themselves in their life, their regular life, I won't say regular, but in their non-sissy life, as heterosexual men. And so I've made friends with, people who are, having sex with women, but are experiencing the sissy thing. And it can be really, really quite difficult. So that basically is essentially that's essentially what sissy kind of is about. And of course, I'm totally open, and please, if there are sissies that think that I have short shrifted or anything, please, I'd love any kind of input around this, because this is such a fascinating phenomenon. It's not at all mainstream, but it is becoming larger and larger. There are more and more people who are identifying as sissy. And so this is the reason that I use this particular picture, because what do we see? We see two men who are cross-dressed. This is called the spanking of the sissy. So spanking of the drag queens. And we've got men dressed in women's clothing, receiving spankings from little girls, and we've got Hillary Clinton smiling in the background. So I thought that this was an interesting and relatively PG-13 rated picture. Much of the sissy animation tends to be more X-rated. So I thought what I would do is I would go to some charts and look to see. One of the things that I was really interested in was what's the signature that shows us what sissy really is, right? What's the signature that shows us what sissy really kind of entails or becomes? And can it be seen in the chart? Can we figure this out in the chart? And so that's what I thought we would do now, is we would come to the chart. So there are a few things that I guess are, in my opinion, and like I said, I want anybody's input, but in my opinion, there are a few things that characterize this phenomena of sissy, the sissy phenomenon. One of them is the cross-dressing and the feminization. And then the second is sexual submission to men. Now, well, that's not necessarily true, because there are many sissies who only play with other sissies and with women, right? So who are totally into the femdom aspect and into kind of I guess I would call them maybe lesbo sissies, right? But they're into playing with other sissies or playing only with women. But understanding that the original kind of idea around sissy was turning heterosexual men into feminized cocksluts becomes a completely different thing. So we've got the transgender aspect, or the gender crossing aspect, and then we have the sexual expression aspect, and then we have the submission aspect, most of which we would want to be, most of which I would want to look for. Now, one of the things that I've tended to notice is that when when I've looked at charts of people who say that they are submissive or talk about how passive they can be, etc., I almost always see a proliferation of mutable signs. And one of the reasons I remember that, I remember reading, I think it was Steve Arroyo who said, this is years ago, obviously, but he was the one who said that he noticed that the mutable signs were not competitive. They were skill-oriented. They were very, very skill-oriented, but they themselves were not competitive. And I have a proliferation of mutable signs in my chart. And a friend of mine, I'm a classically trained singer, and a friend of mine who I went to college with was with a bunch of friends of ours, and his quote about me was exactly this. He said, Antoine isn't competitive. He's just really good. And so that's a little bit of a non sequitur, but it's this aspect about competition is about being top dog, is about being king of the hill, right? There are winners and losers. If we're really competitive, we're winners and losers. There are winners and losers, and we're competing to be the winner, right? We're competing to be the alpha, competing to be the top dog, competing to be the king of the hill, right? Thus, if you're not into competition or if you're somewhat passive, etc., then like I said, I have seen a proliferation. I have tended to see a proliferation of mutable signs. And so one of the things that I have seen in some of these, now, of course, also when we're talking about any kind of transgenderism or crossing over between the genders or blending of the genders, then we're talking about something that is double-bodied, something that is more than one. And of course, the mutable signs are what we call double-bodied signs, right? So Gemini has two twins. Sagittarius is part man, part horse. There are two fish in Pisces, and the Virgo is the virgin and the whore. Right? So there's a duplicity, there's a dual response or expression in each of these different signs. And so, of course, in this particular chart, now this is a friend of mine who is a sissy, and I know this person relatively well. In this particular case, what we see is Virgo rising. So one of the things that I noticed, or one of the things I was looking for, when I was looking for kind of signatures of being a sissy. Well, the first thing I was looking for was I was looking to see Venus, right? Because Venus is sex, and because I was seeing it primarily as a sexual phenomenon. But then as I started noticing these charts, I started seeing this interesting pattern or connection, and it had to do with actually the moon. And now the moon, we've thought about, we know the moon tends to be emotions, etc. But one of the significations for the moon is women. The moon is the significator for women. I mean, the moon and Venus are both the female planets, but the moon herself is the significator for women and mothers. And so what I started seeing was there was all of this connection with the moon and guess who? Mercury, or some kind of connection with Mercury and the moon. And what was interesting to me around that was the fact that both the moon and both the moon and Mercury are called mutable and convertible. Remember, if you remember from the moon in traditional astrology video, there was a really, really strong message around the changeability of the moon. And not just the changeability of the moon, but the inherent or potential instability of the moon if she is not in connection with another planet, because she takes on the nature of the other planet, right? And then also we know that Mercury is hermaphrodite, right? Mercury is male with the male planets. He's female with the female planets. He's neutral and hermaphrodite. He's diurnal with the diurnal planets. He's nocturnal with the nocturnal planets, which essentially translates into masculine and female, masculine and feminine. So Mercury themselves is already hermaphrodite. The moon is always in a state of change and takes on the nature of whomever she touches. The other thing that I saw, and of course I haven't looked at chart after chart after chart after chart, but just in the few charts that I've seen and that I'm going to kind of share today, what I have actually seen is a proliferation, well, connection between the moon and Mercury on some level, and then I won't say a proliferation, but sometimes an emphasis on the sign of Virgo. Now, what's important about the sign of Virgo? We just talked about that Mercury is hermaphrodite, but Virgo is Mercury's feminine nocturnal expression. It's Mercury's female sign. Thus, if we're dealing with Mercury as an agent of change or an agent of mutability or an agent of, what was it to say, convertibility, right? Convertibility, what you can convert from to, then it makes perfect sense that it would be Mercury's, and especially in this respect of gender convertibility, right? We're converting from the masculine gender to the feminine gender. Then it makes perfect sense that we would be seeing Mercury with Virgo, or we would be seeing planets in Virgo, or things with Virgo with the moon, or whatever. We're going to be looking at maybe 2 or 3 charts with this. This is going to be a little bit longer astrology of Kink today. So what we see here is the moon and Mercury in Virgo in the first house, which is the body, with Venus. Now, this is the only chart, I think, that really focuses on Venus. And this particular, and Sissy 1 was especially obsessed, not obsessed, but especially preoccupied with feminization. They were quite scared about expressing themselves sexually, although they wanted to. And they were, of course, they were also having problems dealing with the issues. This person was, you can see this person is only 25. I met them before. I met them in 2019, 2018. So the person was 21, 22, and in quite a bit of conflict over their situation, even mentioning that they were still having sex with women, and when they were with the woman that they wanted to actually be her instead of, it was really quite a difficult thing for her, for them. I'm going to use they, them for most of our sissies. And so what we've got the moon right on the ascendant, 2 degrees away. We've got the Mercury, or 3 degrees away. We got the Mercury. So the moon is applying to the Mercury. The Mercury is applying to the Venus. And then all of them are on Rahu, or the North Node. Now, you know that I'm a Vedic astrologer as well, and that I am very into working with the nodes in that way. And one of the things that we know about Rahu is that Rahu tends to create things that are unconventional, things that are foreign, things outsiders, foreigners, unconventional, criminals, underworld characters, anything that's kind of not within the norm tends to fall within the Rahu area. Now, of course, Western astrology doesn't necessarily use that, but here we see that it's kind of making sense. Now, this, in my opinion, this chart, this was the first Sissy chart that I ever saw, and it seemed to be completely, in my opinion, it seemed like it was like, oh, wow, this absolutely says it all, especially because all of that stuff's happening in the first house of the body. And they, Sissy 1, were very, very, very preoccupied with the converting physically, right? So even talking about possibly being transgender, of course, a person that young who's dealing with these issues, it can be difficult to accept oneself, right? It can be difficult to accept oneself and to accept where one fits, especially they were from the deep South. They were in the military. And so all of these things are classically masculine. They were in very, very classically masculine environments, but experiencing themselves in this sissy fashion. So this chart, in my opinion, really shows the preoccupation with the convertibility into a female. And yes, and I remember also asking, well, what kind of sissy are you interested in being? Are you interested in the feminization? Are you interested in blah, blah, blah? And they said, I'm interested in the sissy porn star. They wanted to be a sissy porn star, but they were super, super interested, or super, super preoccupied with with the feminization as well. And, always talk, showing me pictures of the makeup they had just bought, the dresses that they had just bought, etc. So very interesting. And in my opinion, this chart, and look at how the part of fortune is there too. All of that stuff is also on the part of fortune. So this chart, in my opinion, is the most, what shall we say? It's the most, I don't want to say descriptive, or it's the one that really, in my opinion, kind of screams sissy. Now, there's somebody that was born at the exact, with Virgo rising, with all that shit on the same day, and they're not a sissy, right? So, I mean, it can obviously go many different ways, and at this point, I'm just not really able to say why they're a sissy and why they're not. But we're going to move on to sissy 2. So now we're looking at sissy 2, and notice that the moon is separating. The last aspect that the moon just made was to Mercury in Virgo. Mercury in Virgo, and that the Mercury is in the 7th house from the part of fortune. It's aspecting the part of fortune, which we always use as another ascendant. Is there any connection between either of those two planets and the moon and Saturn, who's the ruler of the ascendant? Not necessarily, right? But notice, well, yes, there is. There is, because Saturn is in Cancer, which is ruled by the moon, whose last aspect is to Mercury. Notice that the aspect before, right? So the moon made a square to Mercury, but before that, the moon made a sextile to Venus and translated Venus to Mercury, right? There's no aspect between Mercury and Venus, but the moon would be able to translate the light of Venus, who is also female, to Mercury, who is in that convertible space. Now, one of the things that we learned when we were talking about Mercury, when we did our Mercury class, was that Mercury is called the ruler of earthly things. The ruler of earthly things. This is Mercury as the magician, over the earth element, over all 4 elements, obviously, because the earth is made up of all 4. So this is where Mercury is actually able to show his skill and dominion over all things, right? Over all things on the earth. He's the ruler of earthly things. And of course, our body, sex, body, etc. All of that stuff are earthly things. And so here we have, and we got the Mercury in the 9th. I don't know if anything that necessarily, but look at how we've got the ruler of the 7th and the 12th. Now, I had a colleague that I initially looked at these things with, and he noticed, he said, hey, I noticed that the ruler of the 7th is in the 12th in a lot of these charts. Now, the self is of course about joining with another and interpersonal relationships. And the 12th is the 6th and the 12th are both about slavery and bondage, right? So it's and submission, submitting to the institution in the 12th house, or submitting to the jail cell, right? Or submitting to the enemy in the 6th house or the 12th, the hidden enemy in the later, right, for the 12th. But remember that traditionally, like way back traditionally, the 6th house was also the house of enemies. So this idea of slavery, of enemy, etc., or slavery / bondage. And one of the things that sissies do is they wear this chastity cup over their penis. They go into something called chastity, and which basically it's to reinforce the fact that they are not men, that they are not acting in a phallic manner, that they are acting, and basically there's a whole huge kind of training regime where you put on the chastity cup, and then you work your ass with dildos in order to make your ass like a vagina, in order to make your ass like the important sex organ, so that there's no interest, there's no response from the phallic aspect at all. So I find that really interesting. And so that's an aspect of bondage, but also we're talking about this. We're talking about sex slaves. Most sissies are willing sex slaves. So I thought that was an interesting thing. And this was another chart where, like I said, I started to see these things and thought, oh my God, look at that. Here's sissy 3. Now, sissy 3 is not quite as, what's the word? It's not quite as much of what's the word I'm looking for? It's not quite as overt. There we go. It's not quite as overt, but what I had been noticing is that there were almost always some kind of moon / Mercury connection. Now in this particular chart, Virgo is not being featured, right? Venus is the ruler of the part of fortune, which makes sense. Notice that the moon has just left Venus. There is no aspect between Mercury and Venus, except for the fact that there is no aspect between them, but Mercury is in Cancer, which is ruled by the moon. So, and the moon is, and look at how the moon is in the 10th house in between both Neptune and Uranus. Now, of course, you know, I don't tend to use them that much, although I'm not totally against them. But in this particular case, you've got the Uranus, which will want to do things that are unconventional. You'll have the Neptune, who wants to create a glamour or an illusion, right? And so, and then we've got the Saturn, who's the ruler of Aquarius, where the moon and the Neptune and the Uranus are, is in Taurus, which is once again ruled by Venus, who is ruler of the part of fortune. So in this particular case, this doesn't quite show quite as much. It's not quite as overt as the other two charts, but it still is a chart that shows us what we're talking about. Sissy 4. So Sissy 4, oh yeah, once again, separating square between the moon and Mercury. And look at how the sign, you know, I didn't even notice this, but the sign Libra has been showing up quite a bit. The last chart, the part of fortune, was in Libra. In this chart, Libra is rising. In what was the chart before, Venus was in Libra. And that was the aspect that the moon was going to make before it made the aspect to the Mercury. So that was something that I didn't notice before. Notice that the part of fortune is in Cancer here, and which makes the moon, women, the ruler of the ascendant. There is this opposition from Saturn, but really the last aspect that the moon made was the square to Mercury, and we saw a square to from Mercury to a separating square from Mercury to, or rather from the moon to Mercury, with Sissy 2. And notice how Mercury, once again, is in Virgo, retrograde in Virgo. So, and look, as we've got this Libra in the ascendant, we've got Jupiter there, which I think is interesting. But as far as kind of this Sissy phenomenon, now there are all kinds of people that have Mercury and the moon, you know, connected. And I understand that. But notice also that the ruler of the 7th is again in the 12th, in Virgo, with the sun in Virgo, right? The ruler of the 7th and the 12th again. Moon and Mercury in separating square. Mercury in Virgo. Moon ruled by Mercury. Part of fortune in Cancer. Libra rising. Venus in Scorpio. Doing anything interesting to anybody? Trining the part of fortune. And then this is 4. Last one is Sissy 5. And Sissy 5, I think I just got a few weeks ago or a few months ago. So I hadn't really looked at the chart. And there tends to be a little bit less. Oh, looks like, oh, Sissy 4 and 5 are the same chart. Okay, perfect. So it looks like that's where we are, and that's what we're finishing. And so thank you so much for joining us. This has been the Astrology of Kink. And please join us again. I will, and like I said, if you've got a chart that you want me to look at and to analyze or pick apart your kink, please send it to Garthastro@garthastro.com. Thanks so much.